Back in session. We have a group they appear to be from Stockton, and we're going to take them 3 and 4 at a time. So I'll start out with Elaine Berut, Nicholas Halton, I believe, Manaya Joy Briggs, and Sayani Adams. Did I say that right or wrong? Sayani, thank you. Yeah, you can just sit here. It's easier to wait that way.
And then whoever's going to testify will be there, right?
Pardon? No, they're going to testify from there.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, go, and we need to get the timer going. So, you know what I'm going to do? Put up 12 minutes for this group, please. Put up 12 minutes for this group. So if you run over 3 minutes, you're running into somebody else's time. On the other hand, if you don't have 3 minutes, you're giving time to somebody else to talk.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Chair Longley and board members. Hi, I'm Elaine Berut, and I'm born and raised in South Stockton, and I'm the program manager for Little Manila Rising. I am here today to respectfully ask you to deny the proposed selenium waste discharge permit and instead have the petitioners prepare a comprehensive EIR report on extending grassland bypass project operations. Like many large urban regions in the U.S., the history of Stockton has been a tale of two cities, a city of stark contrast and disparate outcomes dependent on one zip code and the color of their skin. The cause of these disparities is rooted in decades of local, state, and federal policies that would marginalize entire communities of Americans and rob them of the opportunity. The implementation of redlining practices would define where that discrimination would take place. 100 years later, the proposed waste discharge permit seems to us like a continuation of redlining. Move the pollution from the lands of those with political power into the waterways of South Stockton, all via a federal government policy approved and implemented by state government agencies. Little Manila Rising works within those previously redlined communities in South Stockton to provide historical context to the fallout of government-created inequities and to create equitable solutions for recovering from the past, including reversing poor environmental outcomes. Little Manila Rising is comprised of people who are part of the South Stockton community. We serve the largest environmental justice community percentage-wise within California. This environmental justice community lives along the San Joaquin River as it enters the Delta. And within this community, a significant number of people fish for sustenance within the Delta. Our community will be ground zero for selenium contamination, resulting from discharge into the San Joaquin River and Delta impacting our soils, our fisheries, and our surface waters. According to Cal EPA data, 17 census tracts within Stockton fall within the 95 to 100th percentile for Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 scores, indicators of a high pollution burden within communities of color. This is why Cal EPA recently partnered with us and a coalition of Stockton-based groups to conduct an environmental justice enforcement initiative. Within this initiative, water quality problems were identified around groundwater contamination issues and drinking water quality concerns. If this board allows for 25 years of selenium discharge from large agriculture polluters into the San Joaquin River to accumulate in the soils and waterways of South Stockton, we will be yet further away from the environmental recovery. We are still dealing with the destruction to the local Filipino community and devastating environmental outcomes related to air quality and the construction of the Crosstown Freeway. How much more pollution are we expected to live with? How is this just? Why are these polluters allowed to discharge pollution into our community? This is why we are asking for a denial of the permit and full environmental review of this discharge proposal. Thank you.
Greetings, Chairman, Board members. My name is Nicholas Hatton. I'm with the LGBT Social Justice Initiative. A 2017 Williams Institute report called The California LGBT Divide illustrates the inequitable conditions that LGBT people who live outside of LA and San Francisco urban hub areas experience. Acceptance, quality of life, and even the length of one's life are greatly reduced at a disproportionate level for those who live in these areas, and it's even worse if you live in the Central Valley. Then let's look at intersectionality. The challenges that our brown and black siblings face within the Central Valley area are a challenge. And then you add on that a layer of the challenges that one faces being LGBT. And you start to paint a picture of the real struggle that our LGBT people endure living along our delta. All because of abstract philosophies involving faith, religion, culture, and politics. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff. I'm really glad to be here because what you've been talking about all day is science. And science is paramount because there's only truths. Truth one, Stockton has the largest percentage of people living in environmental justice communities in California. Truth two, the Delta and Stockton area waterways are already impaired for psyllium discharge, and over 40,000 members of the Delta environmental justice community catch and consume fish from the Delta for sustenance. And homeless people don't have a choice on whether they can eat one fish per week. Truth three, the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Interior has criticized recently the Grasslands Bypass project to treat selenium-filled water as a failure. So why is this board considering discharging this water to Stockton? If the lands that contain selenium are too polluted to farm, it's a waste of water and it shouldn't be farmed. As part of Stockton's environmental justice communities, we demand greater clarity on the scope, components, history, economics, and environmental impacts of continued operations of the Grassland Bypass project and the continued marginalization of the already marginalized people of Stockton by further degrading our environment. You see, that's one California divide that we can all do without. Thank you.
Good afternoon, board members. My name is Sayani Adams. I'm a Stockton native, and I'm an active member of a local youth engagement group, art collective named With Our Words Youth Poetry Collective. As a member of the Poetry Collective, it is my job to perform poetry, and as a poet, it is my job to spit the truth like water. It's my job to raise my voice for the voiceless and to be brave in a space that is unfamiliar with my kind of face. Today, I'm here to represent voices that aren't here in this room right now. Approximately 70% of the San Joaquin Valley populace are people of color. The city of Stockton accurately reflects this within our own cultural diversity. We are a very diverse Delta people. 69% of Stockton citizens live in an economically distressed zip code, and in 2017, Stockton ranked #1 as the most economically distressed large city within the state, with the point score of 94.6 out of 100. We treat the Delta like we treat people of color, and maybe it's because we're both brown. I may exist within the American margins as a poor ethnic minority, but I am no different than anyone else in this room, and the fact that I need this water to survive. Today, we are making essentially a life or death decision. One should never poison the water when it is being shared. This is a basic community principle that peoples of all nations have followed for generations, and I'd prefer not to sit here and act like I am not feeling a bit anxious for the future of the health of me and my family and my city. If the Delta dies, we all go with her. And if we are to be stewards of the environment, why would we purposely place chemicals in the water that would make it unsafe for anybody to even use? Safe water isn't a human right, it's a human necessity, and these so-called parameters are not good enough. To allow selenium to enter into our water streams is a death sentence for all of California. So on this day, I'm asking that the board members pick your poison wisely and to deny the approval of the selenium discharge permit. Thank you.
Good afternoon, board members. My name is Manaya Joy Briggs. I am an active member of the With Our Words Youth Poetry Collective located in Stockton, San Joaquin Valley. Since 2008, we've been representing youth voices of color inside the environmental justice movement, telling stories about the Delta with voices from the Delta. I have lived in the San Joaquin Valley for 18 years. For the first 8 years of my life, I had to live with RSV, a precursor to full-blown asthma for those of you who don't know, because of the poisons in the air. I would hate to imagine someone having to live with selenium in the water. It has come to my attention that the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board wants to permit the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, the Grasslands Bypass, and the in the Wetlands Water District to discharge their polluted water into the San Joaquin River, which flows into Stockton's water system, and Stockton's sinks for people living in Stockton to drink. Not only would this poison water for both people and wildlife alike, it would also violate Governor Newsom's executive order, which would ensure that there would be a budget in place to eliminate the fear of the diseases diluting the water for 1 million Californians. And now that the legislative language is out of the way, let's get real. In 6th grade math, we're taught about integers as in, what can make positives and negatives when multiplied together. Positive multiplied by a negative is a negative multiplied by a positive is a negative, and a negative multiplied by a negative is a positive. It doesn't take the smartest person in the world to see that what you're trying to do is apply a 6th grade concept to an environmental equation to the detriment of the delta. Instead of sending more polluted water into the already polluted water, send the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority back to school and make them come back with a better solution. One that's not filled with selenium, one that's not killing the delta wildlife, and one that ensures the lives of the next generation. My generation. The one that you're so concerned about, the one that all of this is for, and the one that will either have to live with or live through your decision. Selenium might not be visible in water, and the Black and brown communities of San Joaquin Valley might not be visible to you, but the damage that it has done and will do to Black and brown and young and poor and indigenous and the members of my generation will be all too visible if you vote no.
Any questions from members of the board?
No, but I really appreciate the perspective that you brought. I know it's not easy to testify, so I appreciate that you took the time and you came, and I'll take your testimony into consideration.
Show your appreciation. Thank you.
And I'd just like to also come in. I mean, you spoke very passionate about your issues, and I definitely did feel it as a member of a disadvantaged community. I know exactly what you are feeling. The most important part about it, that I liked about your presentations, it was you, the community, speaking. You're not environmental justice. You are residents that live in a community that's been impacted. To me, that's all the difference in the world, and I really do appreciate you being here and representing yourselves. You did a marvelous job in stating your case.
Did you have something to say? I saw you raise your hand.
No, I'm just agreeing with what you said.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next is Tim Stroshare, Mariah Looney, Molly Colton, and James Cox. Oh, somebody else. So, who begins? Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair Longley and board members. I am Tim Stroshane, policy analyst with Restore the Delta.
And I want to say, excuse me if I mispronounce any names.
Oh, that's all right.
Thank-
I'm used to it. I am here today to ask you to deny the proposed selenium waste discharge permit for the Grassland Bypass project. The state of California defines environmental justice as the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, and requires consideration by state and federal agencies of whether EJ communities bear disproportionate environmental impacts and risks from new developments or policies. The Stockton Coalition partners whom you're hearing from today, including Restore the Delta, provided the board a list of Delta EJ communities in our letter of November 26. The proposed waste discharge permit fails to address the EJ impacts of extending the permit to the Grassland Bypass project for 25 more years. There must be a cumulative impact analysis that addresses effects of the permit on Delta EJ communities. It should account for the proposed voluntary agreements for Central Valley Rivers, single tunnel project, diversions, continued operation of the Grassland Bypass project, and climate changes to valley hydrology, reducing flows in the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. The Region 2 Basin Plan declared the northern San Francisco Bay, including Suisun Bay to the western delta, as impaired for selenium, and considers that changes to delta flow regimes could lead to greater selenium loading and bioaccumulation in impaired areas. Region 2's finding of selenium impairment is based on an abundant invasive clam in Bay Delta sediments, bioaccumulating selenium in its tissues. Slower flows in summer and fall or during drought can cause selenium to become more available to clams and to their predators, which can include diving birds and bottom-feeding fish. Anglers are warned regularly, according to Region 2, not to catch fish from these waters when the potential for selenium contamination is high. This toxicity can erupt very quickly. Croplands relying on irrigation water in the selenium source areas of the western San Joaquin Valley should be retired and put to other uses. These could include dryland farming, solar farms, agro-industrial uses such as cold storage, warehousing, and equipment supply. Retiring lands from irrigation would help reduce selenium activation into groundwater and surface water flows into the San Joaquin River and Delta. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, and this group should also have 12 minutes total, so put 9 up, please.
Hello, Chairman and the board. My name is Mariah Looney. I'm the campaign coordinator for Restore the Delta, and I'm also a resident of Stockton, born and raised. Stockton is a city that is fresh out of bankruptcy. It's also a very young city. If you look at the 2018 report by the mayor's office, almost 40%, 39.6 to be exact, residents are under the age of 25. Our youth are disconnected from our waterways, and a lot of that is due to fear of pollution. Also, the commercial fishing industry is a $750 million economy for the Delta. The threat of contaminated fish will wreck that economy, but it will also drive youth further away from their historical heritage within the Delta. Contaminated fish is a threat to pregnant moms. As I said earlier, Stockton is a young community with, I believe it's 28.6% under the age of 17, to give you more perspective. And we will see increases in pregnancies over the next 25 years as people tend to migrate from the Bay Area into the Valley. Also, Stockton is known for its food deserts in low-income communities. If you look at South Stockton, there is one grocery store for like 100,000 residents. Whatever the reason for fishing, survival, or recreation, it is our right to be able to do so under the California Constitution, and the right to be taken from Stockton because of pollution from selenium discharge is unacceptable. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Good afternoon. My name is Molly Colton, and I'm an organizer with Sierra Club California, representing our many members throughout the Central Valley and a coalition of other environmental groups concerned with water issues in the region. For the reasons below, we request that the Regional Board deny the proposed tentative waste discharge requirements for surface water discharge permit and that no new use agreement be granted. First, a mere addendum to the 2009 EIR is inadequate. A full CEQA analysis must be done to wholly inform the public of the environmental impact the proposed discharges would have on the region's water systems. The initial 2009 EIR was based on the premise that all drainage discharged in the San Luis Drain would cease by the end of 2019. But under the proposed tentative waste discharge requirements, contaminated discharges of stormwater and agricultural drain water laced with selenium and other toxic drain water materials such as salt, sulfates, boron, and mercury, would continue draining through the San Luis Drain to Mud Slough and the San Joaquin River and the Delta Estuary, a region whose residents experience environmental injustices daily for an additional 25 years. This would have numerous environmental impacts, including cumulative impacts to downstream beneficial uses, a failure to meet protective water quality standards for communities and ecosystems, and impacts to endangered and listed species and migratory birds. This extension is a substantial change and will have significant impacts that should be analyzed in a full EIR, not just a CEQA addendum. Secondly, the monitoring and reporting program that was revised by the Regional Board in 2015 is inadequate to determine the level of pollution being discharged by the Grassland Bypass Project and adjacent agricultural lands and the harm it is causing to the environment. The reduction in monitoring frequency and locations will prevent the collection of necessary data sufficient to protect public trust values and endangered species and to adequately evaluate compliance with water quality standards. And lastly, the alternatives analysis omits land retirement. By ignoring permanent land retirement, the proposed plan will continue to kick the can down the road and concentrate salt, selenium, boron, and other toxic substances in the shallow aquifers of the grassland area. This creates an ongoing risk of toxic selenium discharges to wetland water supply channels and the Bay Delta estuary, especially in wetter years. Moreover, the continued irrigation of these toxic soils in the region constitutes an unreasonable use of water, and continued and future disposal of agricultural drainage in ponds, on land, and in surface will cause significant harm to public trust resources and violates non-degradation policies. We strongly urge the Regional Board to deny this waste discharge permit and that no new use agreement be granted.
Good afternoon. I am Jim Cox. I am president of the California Striped Bass Association. I'm a retired charter boat captain and I'm a lifelong Bay Area resident. The EPA at various times has called the San Joaquin River one of the 5 most polluted rivers in the country. It is so polluted that in the new water fix plans, the water department is trying everything they can to try to keep San Joaquin River water from going back into Clifton Court. So they don't want the water back that they're giving us. We live in the high-tech capital of the world, but yet we can't find a solution to this problem. When I was in the charter business and ran my boat on the water, if my boat leaked oil into the water, I was liable for a hefty fine. Where I live in Antioch, the storm sewers drain directly into the river. On every inlet, there is a warning not to put polluting materials into the storm or you will be prosecuted. Yet you're considering giving a permit to an agricorp that does all these things that if you or I were going to do, we would be prosecuted. All these toxic releases into the water have an incredible effect on the fishery. Imagine my position as a charter boat captain and I have a customer on the phone who wants to go fishing and says, well, can I catch striped bass? And I say, yes, I can catch plenty of striped bass. Can I eat them? Nope, no, you can't. Puts me in a very interesting position to try to talk somebody into going fishing for a fish you can't eat, especially if you're a woman of childbearing age. So for 20 years, a woman can't eat striped bass because of the toxics in the water. So we have a big mess to clean up. And in my experiences with cleaning up messes, you have to stop creating the mess before you can clean it up. And that's what we're asking today. Don't issue this permit. Find a way to stop the contributing mess and then clean it up. The people of California are relying on you to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the panel?
No, I appreciate you all being here, and like I told the other group, I know it's not easy to come and testify, but we appreciate it. You know, personally, I'll take it into consideration. Doesn't mean I agree with the characterizations that you know you might testify to, but I'm certainly grateful that you came.
And thank you for being able to stay a little longer. The next card I have, Eugene Fuss and Barbara BarriganPerea. Eugene, I don't have a card for you. I wrote your name down here. How do you spell your last name?
FUSS. I submitted a card outside.
You probably did, and it got lost somewhere. That's all right, because I wrote it back down again. Is there anybody else from your group that has come in that's not come up here to testify? Good. Go ahead, please. Put 6 minutes up.
I am Gene Fuss, a longtime Stockton and Delta resident and chemical engineer. I am presenting the bigger picture on the potential future, if it is granted, of selenium increased discharge from the Grasslands Bypass project. The Delta is already impacted. Both a potential tunnel diversion upstream on the Sacramento River to feed the Westlands agricultural proposed water usage, and the Kings River floodwater diversion from the will take away from the rest of the San Joaquin River and will add to leaching toward the grasslands. So, this will increase your water runoff to us of polluted water and will radically reduce the diluting water flow through the Delta. Therefore, flushing of selenium from the Delta will be further impaired. The Delta is currently just below acute toxicity. Continued discharges from the Grasslands Bypass project will increase the selenium concentration of the Delta into the acute toxic regime. The selenium reduces reproduction via the eggs and the larvae of the Delta indicator species, the Delta smelt, the canary in the coal mine. No Delta smelt were captured in the standard draw for smelt in October. Only about 25 Delta smelt were captured in an extended draw. This near absence of this indicator species tells us unquestionably that the Delta is already unhealthy. Additional selenium from the Grasslands Bypass project will turn the Delta into a toxic swamp as an unintended negative consequence. I request that you deny the revised selenium discharge permit and retire lands from agricultural and look for potential solar farms. Thank you.
Chair Langley, thank you, and board. I'm Barbara BarriganPerea with Restore the Delta, and I would ask for my full 3 minutes, please, because we have waited an extra amount of time today.
You have 3.5.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you. I've changed my comments today after sitting and listening, and here is why I think the permit, the 25-year permit, should be denied, based on what I've heard today. You don't have a full set of data on selenium accumulation in fish. Therefore, you should not grant a 25-year permit. You should not grant a long-term permit for a work in progress, because that's what I heard your understanding of impacts to fisheries is, a work in progress. Westland's discharge is still on the 303D list. The 209 EIS analysis referred in presentations was for ditches, not ponds, which requires a different analysis. Your data gap is 8 years long for fish in what was presented today. You're not using the full and best data for a 25-year permit. You have no assessment of bioaccumulation on fish and clams in the Delta. The impacts on Delta fishers is not considered and has not been analyzed because the state has yet to complete an analysis of subsistence fishing in the Delta. We at RTD, for WaterFix testimony, at least identified the number of subsistence fishers, which is approximately 40,000. You should not grant a 25-year permit with such a long to-do list. While we don't think this permit should be allowed and constant discharge into the rivers permitted, it would make at least more sense for a 1-year temporary permit with reevaluation as to what are the safe levels of selenium in fish using the best science. You also have to look at the context for this permit. The Delta is not just facing one problem or one issue. We have a bullseye on our back. State and federal fishery protections have been rolled back. Water exports have been increased. The Bay Delta Plan has yet to be implemented. The voluntary agreements are rumored to cut flows into the Delta to lower levels than what was proposed in the Bay Delta Plan. A 6,000 CFS tunnel is being planned to take away the best water. And now we're going to put a 25-year permit for discharging selenium into the Delta on top of all of that. You have to evaluate it in this context. We are being transformed into a stagnant, polluted water region for the powerful, for the San Luis unit, which contributes roughly 0.3% to the state's GDP. But yet, there has been no economic analysis done by the state on the value of clean, fresh water and a healthy delta estuary to the state's economy. The state continues to allow for the irrigation of these polluted lands with fresh water from the delta to benefit an industry made of wealthy, well-connected individuals who are really not California's top job makers. The truth is that granting this permit is a continuation of a discriminatory water policy that makes winners and losers, and that started with California's history with our tribes. It will also continue the institutional racism it inflicted on Stockton's historic environmental justice communities. So please, do the right thing, deny the permit. Better yet, please ask if irrigating these drainage-impaired lands is truly a beneficial use for California's limited water supply under our Constitution. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. I have cards now for Karen Wilson, Chelsea Volberg, or Jeffrey Volberg, I'm not sure, and Mike Lynx. Once again, I apologize if I butchered a name. Please let me know how to pronounce it. Yeah, you got to punch on.
Oh.
And put 9 minutes up, please.
Okay. Yes. Hello.
Okay, go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah, my name's Karen Wilson for South Fork Trinity Upriver Friends. I submitted a letter that went in yesterday to your packet, I believe. Anyway, and I'm very sorry I got lost and I missed your staff presentation, and I don't see a handout, so I'm really sorry I missed that. But from what I understand, I know it is definitely your responsibility to use the most recent science. That's the one thing I really, believe you should keep in mind. I think it's important the Bay Delta Water Quality Plan be implemented before you take this step to make a plan for 25 years, especially because this plan, okay, there's extremely clean water coming from the Trinity River. Usually it would flow out to the ocean, but it's pumped into the Sacramento River, 50% of it. Very, very clean water. Comes down the Sacramento River, and it's really a shame to think that it would go to lands that are so polluted with selenium naturally. I mean, selenium has some good, they're needed for, people to live, but in larger quantities like that, it's poisonous. It's kind of like the old hydraulic mining. You use this really clean water and just blast it, and what's left is polluted, poisonous water. So I really think you need to demand that the rest of those lands be retired so that water's not just making that selenium get loose and the other chemicals that are polluting it. So I'm going to, I looked up ways to remove selenium by water treatment plants, and I would really recommend you look into that. You are Water Quality Control Board, right? So what I found is that they sometimes inject them into wells, sealed wells, the waters that are so polluted. Then there's some kind of a bacterial process. There's some kind of a, supplying ions or something like that. Anyway, look into that. Know that you can clean it before you add it to already very close to endangered waters. Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, my name is Jeffrey Volberg, and I'm Director of Water Law and Policy with the California Waterfowl Association. And we support the adoption of the tentative waste discharge requirements for the Grassland Bypass Project. California Waterfowl has invested millions of dollars in projects to restore waterfowl habitat in the grasslands area. The grasslands area is the largest remaining wetland habitat for waterfowl in California and is very, very important nationally and internationally as a stopover on the Pacific Flyway. Supports millions of migrating waterfowl every year. We're very committed to preserve and protect this very special place. The Grassland Bypass Project has been successful in protecting the water supply channels and preventing ponding of toxic water on thousands of acres of public lands, including state wildlife areas and national wildlife refuges, also on private lands that have invested enormous amounts of private money in waterfowl habitat for the public resource of waterfowl. California Waterfowl Association provided biological science and advocated for a solution to the Kesterson crisis back in the 1980s. We support collaborative programs that allow the grasslands to maintain and improve water quality in coordination with agricultural districts. The proposed waste discharge requirement will protect the grassland wetlands water supply and prevent horrible poisoning of millions or thousands of waterfowl. We need to avoid a return to management practices that led to the Kesterson disaster. And I also would like to say that we really appreciate the efforts of staff and their engagement on managed wetlands issues in recent years and look forward to working with the staff going forward.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Lyons. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Audubon, California, the state office of the National Audubon Society. And Audubon is known for primarily representing the interests of birds and people that are concerned about birds and bird conservation and wetlands. But we also very highly value and work on issues related to other fish and wildlife and the preservation and their habitats and those species, as well as the other uses for people and the beneficial uses of water for people. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this is obviously a very difficult decision with a lot of complexity to it. This has already been discussed today. And in the perspective I just wanted to provide was a little bit about the sort of trade-offs or the hope that I'm frankly hoping you don't make. From the wetland perspective, just to start there for a minute, I think you already know California has something less than 5% of its wetlands left. And that means where once we had tens of millions of waterfowl, millions and millions of shorebird, we would 40 million waterfowl about 100 years ago. Now we have 6 or 7 million that show up. And those numbers are continuing to decline and likely to be with greater challenges, especially for other species like shorebirds with climate change. And so that just demonstrates for a moment just how important places like the Grassland Ecological Area is for the preservation of species on the Pacific Flyway. Grasslands in particular is home to a lot of species of special concern. And so our concern about whether there's impacts to grasslands from a change here are really significant. Likewise, if there is an attractive nuisance created because of the ponding that starts to resemble the Kesterson problem we had in the 80s, that's an issue that has to get tackled and we can't allow ourselves to go back to. But that said, any final decision here really has to include a plan that protects fish and wildlife and considers the impacts to people, including fishers, for monitoring and have real adaptive management. And I think ultimately that's going to fall on you as the decision makers. If you decide to approve this today, whether in good conscience you will allow it to be reopened if the information presented to you really lends itself to that. Because I think so often we adopt these plans and promise to do mitigation later. We promise to do better later. And that doesn't always happen through the bureaucratic process. And so there's immense responsibility that's put on the shoulders of you as the decision makers and as the state board. I'm sorry, and the staff here. So just with that acknowledgement of the difficult balance, and really in this heavily altered landscape, I don't think we want to be shifting burden from one environmental sector to another. And so we have to be trying to find some additional solutions that avoid that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. It's very valuable. Is Jonas Minton in the audience? There you are. You have a hat on. I didn't recognize you. Jonas, come on up, testify. I typically wear a cap, but
Thank you. I am Jonas Minton with the Planning and Conservation League.
Microphone.
I am Jonas Minton with the Planning and Conservation League. Prior to that, as part of my duties, I was head of the Office of Water Conservation for the state, where we dealt with drainage issues about 35 years ago, these same issues. And then as I continued there, being a deputy director at DWR, these keep coming back and back and back. Let me first give you a quick big picture view of this. What do we know? We know that in California, irrigated agriculture is going to be reduced, probably about 500,000 acres due to Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the things that go on that you're revealing your leadership with CV salts. So an important question is, which land should go out of production? Should they be productive lands? Certainly not. But should they be lands that are problematic? And this has been problematic at least since 1985, since I was first exposed to these issues. So that leads me certainly in the Planning Conservation League to say that this is not the time for you to issue a 25-year permit. There are too many things that are in flux, not just the scientific questions about the fish and so forth, but California's water future, water trading. How are we going to get through? In addition, there are a lot of specific reasons. I've given your staff a list of them. Let me touch on just a couple so you have a sense of the kinds of specific deficiencies that will be problematic. For instance, Appendix G of the current use agreement references an upper watershed exemption that requires an upper watershed selenium monitoring system. The use agreement stipulates that, quote, no amount of discharge will be exempted pursuant to Appendix G unless an upper watershed selenium monitoring system has been developed as described in the appendix and submitted to and approved by the Oversight Committee. Pretty straightforward. Yet the Oversight Committee has not met in over a decade, and there is no mention of this upper watershed selenium monitoring system in the WDR. And yet this project will collect these storm flows from outside the federal San Luis unit service area and discharge them using the San Luis drain without compliance with the federal agreement and congressional authorization. And as I say, I've shared with your staff a list of 10 specific deficiencies in addition to the big picture. So thank you. We urge you not to approve a 25-year permit at this time.
questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have more cards here. I just have to find them. No, they're buried here. Ellen Weir. followed by Rick Ortega. You can both sit down here, yeah.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the board. I'm the General Counsel for the Grassland Water District in Los Banos. We support the waste discharge requirements and really thank staff for their hard work over many months to respond to stakeholder requests and refine the proposed requirements. We have another big picture, and that is that this project is called the Grassland Bypass Project because it was designed to bypass this water around the grasslands. We are the grasslands. We manage thousands of acres of habitat, very important for fish, wildlife, birds, listed species, et cetera. And the ability of this project to continue operating solely for the purpose of responding to storm events is critical to our wetland water supply channels and also to the habitat within the wetlands. It was noted in the response to comments that, quote, "This is an important balancing act," and I think that's become clear, "that has taken substantial evidence in the absence of which stormwater has the potential to pond against and flow into wetland channels, transporting naturally occurring selenium into sensitive wetland habitat." We believe the two purposes of this stormwater plan, one, to prevent and avoid water ponding that will attract birds to the drainage area and cause wildlife impacts, and also two, to prevent the discharge of water into our water supply channels from the drainage area, are both essential for the protection of millions of birds and other wildlife that live in the grasslands. The additional conditions and obligations in the proposed requirements are responsive to stakeholder comments. They include multiple reopeners, additional plan submittal requirements, annual meetings, more detailed monitoring and reporting, and the commitment to respond to this emerging science on split tails. The proposed WDRs are not a basin plan amendment. There's no evidence that they will contribute to an exceedance of the existing selenium standards in the San Joaquin River at Vernalis and the more stringent selenium standards that will take place starting January 1st in Mud Slough. So if this board chooses to revisit its existing standards because they don't feel like they protect fish or public health, they should do that. But that's not what this hearing is about. This is also not a water rights hearing. I think people are rightly critical of, long-term water contracts, but they should take those up with the state water board that issues water rights for farming on the west side. We see no feasible or better alternative to managing stormwater that flows across this landscape. The finding number 8 in the proposed WDRs correctly states that, quote, "The discharge of storm-related flows that flow downslope cannot be prevented." We urge you to adopt the proposed WDRs today, and we commit to remaining engaged in the management of stormwater and the monitoring and protection of wetland water qualities, both in the grasslands and downstream. We invite you all and members of the public stakeholders to come and visit us, see our environmental education center where we bring public school children out to view the wetlands, hike the trails, and really experience why we feel strongly that these wetlands need to continue to be protected.
You're good. Thank you. Chair Longley, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Rick Ortega. I'm the general manager of the Grassland Water District. We convey water to state, federal, and private wetlands in the grassland ecological area, some of the most important habitat for migratory birds in all of the Americas. Collectively, we host millions of birds annually, in addition to many other species of wildlife. The grassland area farmers have coordinated historically very closely with my organization and myself directly for nearly 3 decades to really avoid stormwater discharges into wetland supply channels. When that has occurred, it has occurred on a few occasions in some really wet years. We basically have to cease all deliveries to the habitat and then burn a lot of water trying to get back to acceptable levels. But they've also been very successful at minimizing ponding adjacent to these areas and in areas that we do not want to cause an attraction of wildlife. And kudos to them for reducing selenium in the San Joaquin by 96%. That's pretty tremendous. Monitoring, survey, and bird hazing has always been and will remain to be an important component of managing stormwater on and off the SJ Road. The planned remote control of over 100 sumps will allow for the segregation of tile and stormwater, which will dramatically improve downstream water quality in Mud Slough, the San Joaquin River, and the wetland complex in the event of a discharge. The habitat GWD serves has benefited tremendously through the implementation of the Grassland Bypass Project, resulting in more productive land and improved wildlife health. The use of the temporary holding basins are critical to both avoiding the introduction of stormwater into the wetland water supply channels during peak flows and meeting the downstream objectives. The grassland area farmers and the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority have also agreed to expand both surface and subsurface groundwater flow monitoring along our common boundary. For these reasons, the Grassland Water District support the staff recommendation to adopt the WDR today. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for presenters? At this point in time, are there any, well, before you folks sit down, are there any other interested persons wishing to testify? Thank you very much. Closing statement by San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority.
Chair Longley, members of the board, David Corey, a grower within the grassland drainage area. Just wanted to be here to respond to questions if you have them, but I'll have just a short closing comments. I want to point out that my family's been farming within the grassland drainage area since the 1940s. My grandfather started farming there back then, long before the San Luis unit ever came online. So there's a lot of discussion and sort of focus on, even I've heard Westlands Water District come up here, point out Westlands Water District has nothing to do with this project. This doesn't involve Westlands, but a lot of focus on the San Luis unit. We've been farming, this is beyond the San Luis unit. We've been farming there, as I said, since before the San Luis unit came on. My grandfather started farming it. I'm hoping that my son, who's now 17, he has envisioned that he's going to continue to farm that legacy, that ground, and continue to farm and take this farming legacy forward for another couple of generations. He's an avid farmer. And our pledge is to continue to do that in an environmentally responsible way. We're very proud within the entire grassland area of the accomplishments we've done in terms of meeting environmental commitments, our load reductions in both salts and selenium, the concentrations. I think it's actually remarkable what we've accomplished, and we'll continue to put that same effort going forward to any challenges we face in the future. As part of that, we're committed to work with the regional board, with the Bay Institute, with Contra Costa, other interested parties for whatever challenges we face going forward. We'll be here, we've been here, and we're continue to invest that resources and that commitment to solve problems that we encounter. So with that, I ask the board that you adopt this WDR and allow us to continue our efforts and to avoid sort of the uncontrolled ponding that Ellen and Rick talked about, that we really is the alternative to allowing the discharge to continue as it has been for, since my grandfather started farming this ground. It's discharge to the San Joaquin River.
Questions, comments? David, I got a couple questions for you. We've heard a lot of testimony, folks concerned about 25-year permit. What impact would it have if we were to reduce this permit to, let's say, 5 years?
Well, one thing about a WDR is that you could take it up next week if you had new information. So a WDR, generally speaking, they don't really have a termination clause, is my understanding. I'm sure your staff can talk about it more, but it's not that we're guaranteed 25 years. It's really what I think the staff has built into this is the ability to revisit this, to have those annual stakeholder meetings so that we can vet these issues and make sure that the voice is heard and any issues that come up can be brought to the attention of the regional board, and regular updates to the regional board with a requirement that it actually be brought in front of the board for consideration in 5 years. But setting a specific deadline of 5 years, I don't think is appropriate at this time at all. Again, if new information comes up through those stakeholder processes, through the diligent outreach of this board and looking at these, if something comes up, I don't think you have to wait 3 months to come back if there's some issue. That can always be done by this board, and I'm certain that given the staff you have and the board that you have, you will address those issues. So I think it's unnecessary.
Another question, given the numerical objectives for selenium of 5 milligram in mud slough and also at the San Joaquin mouth of Merced River to Renalis. Is it possible to pull that down to 2, and if not, why not?
We've always operated the project to reduce that as much as possible, and that was one of the points I made with our load targets. We've always limited the amount that we discharge as much as possible, and we'll continue to do that. In a storm event, we're sort of take what we're given. And the reality of it is, when the rain hits the ground, it flows downhill, and we only have 2 choices. I mean, it's really either we're going to let it move downhill to the river, or we're going to hold it back and pond it. So we have very limited choices in that.
So
And I'm, you know,
you bring up an issue
Yeah.
that I really need more information on from staff, and that is that, let's take the scenario that in fact there was no more farming in that area. The storms still come.
They do.
Except there is nobody there then to manage the storms. And by the way, the storms have been coming for centuries,
Exactly.
maybe a million years, or longer. And because of the selenium that was deposited on the east side of the Coast Range with the volcanic activity, it tends to be in a soluble form, and it flows towards the San Joaquin. And you're drier there, so it tends to dry up. I get that from what information that was provided all the way back in the Rainbow Report.
Right.
The issue of managing that selenium over time with the storm events is a very critical one. And I think that has to be separated from managing selenium that comes from the farming operations per se. Because I think if you look at the data, you will see that the runoff tends to be pretty high quality as far as TDS is concerned. And it's much better than what's coming out of the drain water. And how to manage those is, from a regulatory standpoint, almost as separate entities, because of the fact that one is not man-made at all. We just have to deal with it. And the other one certainly is influenced by man's activities.
Well, the storm flows coming off, or certainly you're looking at a 2 part per billion standard in the wetland channels. The storm flows, you know, even if farming didn't exist up there, they would far exceed that. There's no way you would meet those numbers in the grassland channels during a storm event. So one thing I think when you look at this, having the grassland bypass project there and those growers there that can take some accountability for that, manage those flows, we actually are in a better position having that ground farm to deal with these inevitable storm flows. We're better positioned with them than without them. And we've done all we can to manage them. We'll continue to do that. And, you asked the question, can we meet 2? I don't know for sure. I mean, we already are in the San Joaquin River. When you look even above the Merced, we're meeting 2. In the wetland channels in Mud Slough, can we do that? I'm not so sure that we can. I'm not sure that it's necessary. We will look at that through the process that's laid out in the WDRs of looking at what is appropriate to protect beneficial uses. We'll do that. We're committed to being involved in those processes and working with our partners, including the regional board, to make sure we come up with something that works. But again, I think you're better off having someone there to manage it than not. And these flows, a lot of talk was about land retirement as a solution. Land retirement does not solve this problem. It actually eliminates a management activity that can actually help resolve it.
That's exactly what I was getting at on there needs to be some mechanism for the storm events regardless of what else happens.
Exactly, yeah.
Any further comments or questions by board members?
Yeah, you mentioned the stakeholders. The stakeholders, you're talking about members of the coalition, all the supportive bodies of that group, or does it include the residents that are going to be receiving the impact of any of this? Who are
Well-
who are all the stakeholders?
Well, what's envisioned in the WDRs is to have annual stakeholder meetings in which anybody who wants to come, similar to our irrigated land stakeholder meetings, can come, and we will discuss the issues involved. I mean, we've worked very closely with the Bay Institute, with Contra Costa, with others in the past, and we'll continue to do that as well as the regional board. But we're willing to talk and meet with whoever to try and resolve issues. I mean, at times, the testimony that was given here with regard to the impacts to the Delta, I understand their concerns, but I don't understand how our project fits into that. When you look at selenium specifically and you look at the water quality data at Vernalis, I mean, those numbers are most of the time non-detect. I mean, a vast majority of it. When they are measured, they're in the they're in the 1 part, well below 2. We're talking really low numbers here. So I don't quite understand. I think it gets, and I'm speculating here, but it seems like it gets into this issue of the San Luis unit and whether that ground should be farmed, and sort of, as Ellen Weird pointed out, sort of more of a water rights question than how do we manage stormwater flows? And again, they're very separate and distinct questions. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Not really. I mean, people are invited to attend, or as you had indicated, but you know where I'm going with this. When I see all of the people out here expressing the concerns, and there's been a range of people that have come and expressed those concerns, where were they in the process, or were there opportunities for them to be engaged in versus them coming to this meeting here?
There certainly were. I mean, we had the workshop in August here. We also had outreach events in our CEQA process, where we had an event in Sacramento to sort of a public outreach session there. We have regular meetings of the Grassland Basin Drainers within the Water Authority, which are open public meetings. There's certainly a lot of opportunity for that input. They really, I can't say as to why they weren't in those other meetings, but we've never tried to exclude or hide anything. We actually, when these things came out, we reached out to those folks who we knew would be concerned or potentially in opposition to this project, because we invite that discussion. We invite that debate to make sure that we have a robust debate and we address the issues that are out there. Can we resolve everyone's concerns on everything? I don't know. Some of them I don't fully understand, because I think they're really addressing a different issue than what we're dealing with here in terms of the stormwater flows. But we invite everybody's input, continually have and continually will. This has been a very, very high profile, and we've never shy away about people's input. And I address any specific question that you had related to the comments they have.
Thank you.
Dr. Longley, if I may, I have a question for Patrick.
Certainly, yeah.
Sorry. Patrick, could you address for me, I know everybody was really concerned about selenium going into the Delta. Can you elaborate on that a bit and the research we have and we've done on this as it refers to this project?
Yeah, certainly. And I do want to say really quickly, I'll respond to Board Member Kadara. In this order, not that we don't trust David, but the burden is on the Central Valley Board staff to convene annual meetings with the stakeholders, and with stakeholders we mean the folks who are coming to this meeting here today and spoke up with very eloquently and with very powerful voices about their concerns. And so that is in this order. It's above and beyond what we normally include in these types of orders, but given the sensitivity of that, we did include that in this order.
Just as a matter of process, and we're going to continue with you, Patrick. Are there any further questions for David? No. We're through with you, David. Thank you.
Totally
we'll move
through
on.
with me.
We'll
Hey, all
move
right,
on.
fine.
Staff comments, and Patrick,
It's
continue, please.
My turn now, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so to get to where we are with selenium, the TMDL that governs the selenium discharges into mud slough and into the San Joaquin River was a product of a very extensive rulemaking. So it's a regulation and it involved a lot of scientific review about what the appropriate numbers were for the protection of all wildlife, including fish species. Birds were the primary most sensitive species when we were doing that type of analysis. The migrating birds eat the fish with the selenium, and then that comes up with levels that resulted in the deformities that gave rise to the Kesterson crisis. So the numbers that are set to 2 in our water quality control plan were based on the best available science. We have nothing in the administrative record that would indicate that number is wrong. However, the 2011 split tail is a big, I won't say a red flag, but it's a yellow flag. It's something that merits a lot of additional research to make sure that the numbers that we set in our basin plan as protective of the beneficial uses are the correct numbers, and if they need to be reduced downward, as Ellen indicated, that's a separate rulemaking process. We can, however, revise waste discharge requirements to go even lower, because our mandate, whenever we adopt waste discharge requirements, is to protect the beneficial uses. And if there's a fish species that's harmed by discharges based on a number that we set inappropriately, we can set waste discharge requirements at a lower number. But again, that's something that we have to do on the basis of substantial evidence, the evidence before the board to make the findings that we need to support that type of limitation in a permit. We don't quite have that yet. We have something that absolutely requires additional investigation. And again, I would emphasize that when we're talking about protection of beneficial uses here, this is not a drinking water issue. When you talk about the scare of selenium being in fish, it is solely related to the health of the fish. If you ate those fish, I don't know if you could, even a subsistence fisher could possibly eat enough fish to have negative impacts of selenium. To be frank, the mercury concerns would hit you way before the selenium numbers. That's another entirely different issue that we're wrestling with and has little, if anything, to do with the operation of this particular project in the San Luis unit. So that's kind of the global picture there. This operation of this facility, as I'm sure you've gathered from the complexity of this hearing, it lies at the nexus of just about every major water quality issue that is in the Central Valley, from environmental justice communities to the operation of water rights, to the importation, export of water, to the Delta, to the health of the Delta, and to all manner of species that depend on this type of water system. So that's one of the reasons why this is such a complex issue. And you know, I have a recommendation I could elaborate on, but I first want to make sure that everybody's technical questions are answered. I know Sue and her staff and Adam are prepared to answer those because this is a tough one.
Well, if you could answer the questions, 2 questions I asked David.
I think, sure, and put a pin in Raji's question too, because I think she's got one there. Could you restate them real quick?
Well, Raji, go ahead with yours.
You know, I'm at the end over here. I have to like make a lot of noise, but that's okay.
Flare gun will give you.
Right. So I guess I would ask you, I know Dr. Longley mentioned it briefly, about the length of the permit being 25 years, and your input and your take on that.
That is absolutely where my recommendation is going, and you know, Sue isn't close enough to throw anything at me for making this recommendation. But built into the permit, and I would guide your attention to, I believe it is on page 16 of the permit itself. There is a provision that go down to the bottom of the page, provision 5. That says that the Central Valley, first of all, to address Denise, your concern, top of the page, 10, right there, is the one where it says Central Valley Water Board staff will hold an annual meeting during the same time each year with the dischargers, responsible agencies, and other interested persons.
Let's find it first.
Yeah.
I'm on page 16, and I see discharge.
18, all right. You got a different pagination there.
Oh, boy.
particular.
Okay, gotcha.
That's always fun. Okay, so still at the top of the page, for those of you following along at home, it's either 16 or 18. The statement is the Central Valley Water Board staff will hold an annual meeting during the same time each year with the dischargers, responsible agencies, and other interested parties to review and discuss the results of the surface water monitoring and management strategy implemented by the dischargers. If the monitoring results raise any concerns, board staff will hold a follow-up meeting with the interested parties to discuss the effectiveness of the management strategy and mitigation measures and any proposed changes. Should constituent concentrations increase or water quality objectives be exceeded, board staff will work with the discharge to determine if a revised approach is needed to reduce constituent discharges. That really was anticipating what some of the discussion would be here today, that the Central Valley Water Board would be tasked with doing that type of outreach and, frankly, capacity building for stakeholders to become involved with the permitting process so that we can really have multiple meetings to air the concerns as this project moves along. The more substantive, for your benefit, a little later on the page, and let me check if it's the same page. It is the same page. Provision 5, a little lower, says that the Central Valley Water Board will review this order periodically and may revise this order when necessary. No later than 31 December 2024, and every 5 years thereafter, Central Valley Water Board staff will present to the board an update on the Grasslands Bypass project, project compliance with the order requirements, and any additional information needed to determine whether the order should be revised. My suggestion is actually that we move up the first of those updates to the board, where the board can make a decision as to whether this order should be revised or not. I think Jessica had a very good idea that we not put it necessarily in a year, but a little longer than a year, because December of next year is when the drainage management plan is due. Then that drainage management plan will be based on the new use agreement, which should be finalized between now and then, and will spell out how this drainage water is going to be managed. So if we have a mandatory meeting that we come back and talk to you, I guarantee you we'll have a lot more information about the fish tissue numbers. We'll have the benefit of adopting this permit today and having an enforcement mechanism that we can use post the expiration of the current use agreement. So as of January 1, we've got better teeth if anything goes sideways. And we'd have the benefit of additional data coming in, say the report that is still in peer review, and we can come back and have another discussion. I anticipate it will be another robust discussion. If something comes up that shows that our numbers from the rulemaking that we had for selenium in the past were incorrect, we're going to get an earful on that. And we'll also hear a lot about how this order is functioning to make sure that selenium concentrations aren't increasing in this area. That would be my suggestion, and I'll kind of huddle with Adam if it's your direction to kind of revise that. I think that, given that the report would be due in December of 2020, we'd want to give ourselves about 6 months to, analyze that, make sure that the community understands what's in that report before coming back to the board, which would kind of put a mandatory reconsideration. Again, I think that the Bay Institute was suggesting that, an interim permit or at least a mandatory reopener reconsideration. So that's kind of in line with that. It's a workload. Our staff is going to be tasked with, doing something in a couple years where they thought they'd have 5 years. But I think that is one way to be responsive to the concerns that we've got here today.
So what do I hear? So you're going to huddle and come up with a date for us, is that correct?
I double check. I double check with Sue real quick to make sure I'm not missing anything with respect to the date. But again, if the board was so inclined, pushing that timetable up from essentially what is a 5-year permit review to what would basically be a 2-year permit review after we get more information, I think would go a long way in helping the public have some confidence that this thing is not going to last 25 years if a problem shows up in year 1 or year 2.
Yeah, as one board member, that's precisely what I'm asking for. Are there any other comments on that?
Yeah, Dr. Long, I guess I was gonna, I mean, you guys have already gone down the path I was gonna head down, so you saved me a few words here. But I mean, given the fact that we need to have some enforcement tool here in the next 2 years, say,
Yep.
if you proceed with that recommendation, it seems like we have to approve something today because the use agreement expires next month, right? Obviously, the Grasslands project has done some real good in terms of preserving the wetlands and reducing flows of selenium to the river. But I'm pretty struck by the number of data gaps that have been identified here and concerns, real concerns that people have raised. And it seems like any one of those could be a trigger within the next 2 years with all of the legal activity and the science that's still unfolding. So I was going to strongly push for reducing the term of this permit or instituting some kind of I think the term was mandatory reopeners,
Yeah.
which is what you're basically suggesting. So if that's the direction we seem to be headed, I'd be
So
supportive.
when you huddle with Sue and come up with some numbers, I like the idea of more mandatory reopeners following that
Yeah.
2 year also.
I would hesitate to say a mandatory reopener because there is a possibility that everything's looking good, so it'd be mandatory reconsideration, and
Well,
at that point, yeah,
The wording's critical, but that's okay.
yeah,
And then this issue about the two micrograms per liter, same thing. 2 micrograms per liter in mud slough. Would it take more science for that?
I think so. I think that's a big deal. That kind of lay at the core of the prior rulemaking process, which is a heck of an undertaking.
I'd like to have that as one of the things on the list to look at the feasibility of that. Mud slough may have been over the eons.
Yep.
20 micrograms per liter. I don't know. I know the west side has always had real issues with long before irrigated agriculture came along.
It's fast. I mean, I think that this board is very cognizant of the fact that how we got here is fascinating. You know, it's when you look at how the San Luis unit was initially conceived. That drain was not a 60, 80-mile drain. That drain was a 260-mile drain that terminated in the Pacific Ocean. Reclamation never built that. It's been the subject of numerous federal lawsuits, various settlements, but this was not how it was supposed to function. And granted, those decisions were made by Congress decades ago. There's very little we can do to kind of force their hand. So we have to do the best we can to figure out what engineering, technical, and social solutions are needed to make sure that whatever harm comes from that is mitigated to the maximum extent feasible. I will say, and I think you heard the chorus of just about every environmental group acknowledging that the bypass of this drainage from the Kesterson area, from the wetland refuges, is incredible. I mean, that really was an engineering solution to an environmental cataclysm. And so we're thankfully we're not at the precipice of that, but we do have some extraordinarily serious concerns.
But when you say that, you've got to bifurcate that into stormwater versus ag drainage.
Absolutely, which are related, but
They're
we
related,
do have.
but that stormwater keeps coming regardless.
Absolutely. And the stormwater is influenced by the hydrogeologic modifications that we made to the entire system.
Right,
It doesn't flow the way it used to, and
But
there's
they-
no
they
reset
used to
button.
They used to get in the wetlands regardless.
You know, I asked Adam to kind of speculate, and I know kind of as scientists and engineers, a little bit of cringing in terms of speculation. Attorneys, no reservation about doing that. But it's interesting to see the flows in this area. There certainly were, you talk about there's certainly much more wetlands in the area. They received flows that had selenium loads. What those selenium loads are, big question mark. But you would have rainfall that would pond, and you would have evaporation. How long those stayed there and what the selenium concentrations were, and then what would happen when all that salt dried up, crusted on the surface, and then was subject to the first rain flush of next year. Would you see a huge selenium and salt spike? Even if there was no human activity in that area, I don't know, but it's entirely plausible that that could be part of the system that was in operation for millennia before, certainly intensive agriculture was in the area. I know there's human habitation going far beyond when there was agriculture in this area, but but we're limited in that type of kind of 2020 hindsight. We have to kind of look at what the systems are out there right now, and I can absolutely say, without equivocation, what David Corey said was correct. We'd rather have this situation be regulated and monitored and have some regulatory hook to say we're going to get the reductions that we need, as opposed to having a lot of uncontrolled stormwater flow out there, pond and evapoconcentrate selenium that could once again result in not one big Kesterson, but a bunch of little pools where avian life could be exposed to high selenium concentrations.
So are there any further questions for Patrick?
My only concern and the question that I raised is for the stakeholders. When we have the audience here and we have people speaking and raising questions and having concerns about a project that's going forth, my issue is whatever the process is for the communities that are in relationship to the projects that are going forth, if their information is incorrect, they need to be given the correct information.
Oh, yeah.
If they have concerns, we need to hear those concerns. And education and community engagement, I continue to stress it. And when we have people in the audience that raise those concerns, we need to be able to responsibly address them and not let it go by the wayside like, no, we're not going to do that. And that's not what they're here for. They're
Yep.
saying they have some issues. So however we can respond to whoever is responsible to hear those concerns, that would make me feel comfortable in making a decision. But, I do have concerns. I continue to be concerned about communities that are impacted, and we deal with it afterward. I raised that concern at the WQCC, and so that's the position
Yeah.
that I'm raising.
I think we got to go to Stockton this year, regardless of what we do.
Exactly.
We got to go to Stockton and have a meeting on this particular issue.
But I concur with Denise. We have to find ways to get funding for more staff to do outreach. It's so critical. Providing fact sheets and then meeting with people so they can better understand the fact sheets that we prepare and so forth is critical.
And I agree with that too. I know that where I come from in Merced, a lot of people though won't get engaged until it's really close to the
Yeah,
end.
yeah.
So sometimes you don't know who to reach out to. We have meetings on different issues and nobody comes. And then just right before the vote, you realize that you could have reached out to
Yeah.
certain communities, but we didn't know. But now that we know and we know where the concerns are, let's make sure that we don't lose track of people that we know are interested.
They were there all the time.
Yep.
You have to figure out a way to reach that segment of the population so they don't have to come here and raise their voices and say, you left me out. That's my concern, seriously.
And I will say, if there's a community organizer type in the audience down in the Fresno office, we just got authorization. Board Member Kadara, I know we spoke about this a while ago. It's been in the works at State Board for longer than I would have liked, but that's what happens sometimes when you're dealing with HR departments. But we are doing a reorganization of administrative resources in the Fresno office to free up a half-time position and hopefully additional more to follow of specific community engagement personnel that can work with the board, get paid and kind of be responsible for this community
We need
engagement.
that capacity in each office.
Oh, you bet. We're building it very slowly.
State board member?
I think you have one of the state board members who's been most supportive of those
Oh, I know
initiatives
she
around,
has.
but
She's
we're
very-
working on it. We're
She's
working
very
on
good
it.
at that, but I'd love to call her attention to it. At least she can tell her fellow board members what we say.
Yeah, I guess I just add, having listened to some of the advocates here today, which I really appreciated the passion we heard, that the outreach shouldn't be limited to this project. I mean, many of the issues that were raised extended Delta water quality in general.
Relationships
And
are fundamental.
Yeah, and selenium isn't the biggest issue in the Delta by a long stretch, so.
Oh, mercury and.
Yeah, mercury and
You want to find a
flows and,
solution, problem that we can spend the rest.
Yeah, so identifying all the data gaps is one last thing I'll say for these reopeners. It seems like a few of the data gaps that were identified today weren't on my radar.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's some kind of a checklist for ones that you guys will be looking at before, say, the next
Absolutely.
discussion.
And I think some of the data was perhaps inadvertently mischaracterized because there's fewer data gaps than was said. And we have been there has been monitoring of fish tissue and mud slough through 2018. It wasn't cut off in 2011. There's a lot of additional monitoring where it drops off of some of the charts that were shown today. We've got the data for a lot of those, and but the big one is the split tail, trying to figure out what the linkage analysis is there, and other things of that nature.
So I think we've given Patrick our concerns. And so what I'm going to do is, I did skip one group here. I forgot to ask the Bureau if they had any closing comments. The Bureau's not commenting today. I hear a negative to that. Good. So we will, 5 minutes, is that enough? 30 seconds. We'll do a sitting in place for recess.
All right, Kieran said I took 61 seconds, so.
Okay, what's
So the decision would be, I think there's kind of 2 points. I think first of all, it probably would not be a permit revision that would be put in front of you, because I think the permit revision in December is probably a bad time because that's right in the middle of managing the stormwater flows. But the suggestion I would make would be that we have the reconsideration set 2024. We move the clock up 3 years, and so that would be at December 2021. We'd have the benefit of a couple more rainy seasons and the drainage management plan and the report on the split tail, and probably wouldn't even have all the answers then, but we'd certainly have a lot more information for the board to make a decision at that point in time.
And so, I like that, because we need that information. And while 2 years may seem like a long time in this business, it's not very long at all, particularly when it takes you time to get good data. I feel sorry for you, but you've got a big load on your shoulders, Sue. So is your So if you could just summarize your recommendation in 30 seconds or less.
It would simply be to replace the 2024 in provision, was it 4? Under provision 4, paragraph 5, the 2024 would be 2021.
And in the record, you're going to look at the possibility of lowering the water quality objective in mud slough.
That would be
I like that in the record.
one issue that that would
Right,
be under
right.
consideration at that
Good.
time.
With that said, I'll close the meeting and keep discussion to the board members. Is there any further discussion? I call for a motion.
I'd move to approve the item as presented, save for the change at provision 4, paragraph 5, which would now read 2021 and not 2024.
Do I have a second to that?
I'll second.
Carmen's moved. Mark is seconded with including the revision. Roll call.
Mr. Bradford,
Yes.
Ms. Brower,
Yes.
Ms. Kadara,
No.
Ms. Ramirez,
Yes.
Dr. Longley.
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. We will take a 10-minute break. Be back in here at 3:30, please.
And I'll just apologize to everybody here. I have another commitment in Merced, so I'm going to be skipping out. But thank you for excusing me and for your participation today.
Oh, yeah, I'll do your phone next.
Do you want to be in the picture?
Yes.
I won't even charge them. Absolutely.
But it's for the good.
What you talked about, in the past millennia, about being the uncontrollable. But you have to remember, in the past millennia, there was much more stormwater coming across the valley floor to dilute any localized spike during the storm season. So even if there was a localized spike, it was getting diluted to the point where it didn't matter. Now we have so heavily modified the storm flow that if we stop, then we are affected now, like we weren't in the past. No, it's not most liquid. What I'm saying is that the volume of water that came through was enough to dilute it down to where it wasn't an issue at the time. Now it would be. So managing going forward is the key.
No, I
Yeah, and I apologize that I wasn't involved in this earlier. I'm very civic-minded. I have a lot of other activities. I only have
how you doing?
available to do this, so I had to
Wonderful, thank
go
you.
through and
what's new
familiarize
with your
myself with a very short time.
It's fast. Keep it on. Keep it straight. Narrow now. Yep. Just about every meeting. I was like, so I'm on the laptop, and they're all like,
and we have to cooperate.
I have one. It's fine. But like for now,
Likewise.
almost there, man. It's one of the older.
Write down your information.
Nice job.
Enjoy your holiday. All right.
Send the court.
Let's just talk about the waters of the U.S. rule.
microphone. Agenda, people don't want to listen to me. Agenda item number 7. Agenda item number 7 is update on water quality certifications program. This time the board will hear an update on the water quality certifications program. Am I correct? This is a 401 program?
That's correct.
It's even broader than that now, though.
It took me 28 years to learn that, but anyway. And staff efforts to implement the State Water Board's new state wetland definition and procedures for discharges of dredged or fill material to waters of the state. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions and provide direction to staff. After the staff presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We'll now hear the staff presentation.
Yeah, and Carl, I hesitate to preview this, but the regulations just changed. So our effort here is to bring you up to speed with what the state board has done and what we'll be doing in the future with the new regulations.
You're talking about the new regs or the old regs?
A little bit of both.
Go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Longley, members of the board. My name is Brian Smith. I'm a supervising engineer in your Reading office. I also serve as the program manager for the stormwater program as well as the water quality certifications program. And hopefully this will be a little lighter presentation than your previous one, but we'll still be touching on wetlands. So, this presentation will provide an update on activities and issues in the region's water quality certification program, including the State Water Board's new dredge and fill policy, also known as the state wetland definition, and procedures for discharges of dredged or fill materials to waters of the state. And as you heard, this is an informational item only, and no board action is being sought at this time. For this presentation, I'll start with some background on the Water Quality Certifications Program. Then I'll provide updates on a few program activities and issues. Then I'll hand it off to Anna Maria Sains, an environmental scientist from the State Water Board, to discuss the State Water Board's new dredge and fill policy. And then you'll hear from Bailey Toft-Dupuis from the State Water Board's Office of Chief Counsel to discuss several items at the federal government level that may affect implementation of our water quality certifications program as well. And finally, I'll wrap the presentation up with the summary and solicit comments and input from you. All right, the work we do in the region generally falls within one or sometimes several of 20 program areas. The information I'll provide today pertains to the 401 Water Quality Certifications Program. It's improperly circled on the screen. Not sure what happened there. Each of the programs on this list has a program manager who oversees implementation of the program across the region's 3 offices. Each program also has a program sponsor who supervises the program manager and represents the program at the executive management level. Assistant Executive Officer Clint Snyder is my supervisor and serves as the program sponsor for the Water Quality Certifications Program. The Water Quality Certifications Program regulates removal or placement of materials in wetlands and other waters of the state. Examples of such projects include navigational dredging, flood control channelization, levee construction, channel clearing, fill of wetlands for development, bridge piers, docks, and roadways. The photo on this slide is of Bass Lake near Oakhurst, and it's a project to modify the dam. In this case, a double turbidity curtain was used to successfully isolate the project area from the rest of the lake and protect water quality. These types of projects generally require a federal Clean Water Act 404, Section 404 permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the state's water quality certification is issued pursuant to Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to certify that the project approved by the Corps will also meet state water quality requirements. As you'll hear later, a project that does not require coverage under a federal 404 permit may, regardless, still require coverage under a permit issued by the water boards. The goal of the Water Quality Certifications Program is to protect the integrity of all waters, but it has special responsibility for wetlands, riparian areas along streams, and headwaters because these water bodies have high resource value, are vulnerable to filling, and are not systematically protected by other programs. The program is also involved with the protection of special status threatened and endangered species. And the program implements the federal and state wetlands no net loss policies. In accordance with California's policy, the Water Quality Certifications Program works to ensure that the Water Board's regulation of dredge and fill activities will be conducted in a manner to ensure no overall net loss and long-term gain in the quantity, quality, and performance of wetlands acreage and values. And the program seeks to avoid, minimize, and mitigate for project impacts. The process for an applicant to apply to receive a water quality certification begins with submittal of an application document. The project information contained in the application is posted on our website to provide public notice of the application and give an opportunity for the public to comment on the proposed project prior to us issuing the certification. Completing the water quality certification application process generally involves a bit of back and forth with an applicant working to get all the necessary project information submitted to us. Then the Water Board staff can write the certification, including any appropriate conditions to ensure wetland and water quality protection. These board orders are normally issued under the executive officer's delegated authority and take the form of either an individual certification or an enrollment in an existing general order. General order enrollments tend to be a bit faster to issue compared to individual certifications. In some cases, we're unable to issue a certification or a permit for a project and must issue a denial. A denial can occur because an applicant fails to provide the necessary information in a timely manner, or we are legally unable to issue a certification or permit due to conflicting state law or regulation. So a little information about the program's workload. On average, the Central Valley Water Board receives almost 300 applications for water quality certifications each year. The actual number of cases varies from year to year, primarily due to the ups and downs of economy-driven housing construction, other development, and public infrastructure work. More recently, wildfire mitigation activities and post-fire restoration and rebuilding have boosted the numbers of applications received. I should also point out that while we receive an average of 300 applications per year, we have an inventory of over 1,400 active cases due to many projects taking more than 1 year to complete. Region 5 by far receives the most applications among the 9 regions in State Board, followed by Region 2 in the San Francisco Bay Area. On this bar graph, the taller gray columns represent the active caseload for each region and State Board, and the shorter blue columns represent the number of new applications received in a year. And the black vertical rectangle is supposed to extend all the way down to the bottom, and that's around the data for Region 5. And this is from fiscal year 2017-18, but it's reasonably representative of the normal average. The State Water Board has developed performance targets for most programs to identify and track achievement of important program goals. In the case of the Water Quality Certifications Program, the established performance targets are associated with timely issuance of certifications. The target is to review applications within 30 days of receipt and subsequently issue certifications within 60 days of receiving complete application materials. The Central Valley Water Board has been doing increasingly well meeting these targets, but the sheer numbers of applications makes it an ongoing challenge for us to keep up. In fiscal year 2018-19, the most recent year with complete data available, Region 5 averaged 29 days for application review and 46 days for issuance of certifications. And this compares to the statewide average across all regions and State Board of 27 days and 43 days. As I mentioned earlier, Region 5 by far receives the most applications among the 9 regions and the State Board. So while we're currently meeting the targets, streamlining the process of issuing certifications is an ongoing focus and a priority for the program. In addition to the processing timelines targets, the State Water Board is also working toward developing environmental performance measures for the program. These can be difficult to track and quantify, but will likely include some measurement of program effectiveness, such as the reductions in acres of wetland impacts achieved through implementation of the program, and a demonstration that there is no net loss of wetlands occurring. Besides reviewing applications and issuing certifications, we conduct other program activities. We try to maintain a presence out of the office in the field, conducting inspections and working on compliance determination and taking appropriate enforcement actions for violations. While inspections are a priority for us, we currently only average about 30 or so per year, or approximately 10% of our new cases. And as I'll mention later, increasing our field activities and compliance and enforcement activities is a priority goal of the program. Our water quality certifications program is assigned the equivalent of just over 9 full-time staff or personnel years, PYs. Yep. Program priorities. Thank you. Where are we at here? Measures. So resources and organization. Our water quality certifications program is assigned the equivalent of just over 9 full-time staff, or PYs, as I said. The PYs are distributed between approximately 13 staff and senior staff working in the program across all 3 offices in Region 5. So many of these staff have responsibilities in other programs as well, not just the water quality certifications program. About 58% of the program staff are in the Rancho Cordova office, 30% in Redding, and 12% in Fresno. I also wanted to mention that 2 of these program staff PYs were authorized following a 2014 state auditor's audit of the state's overall water quality certifications program. Among other things, the audit noted insufficient staffing to achieve timely issuance of certifications, and also expressed the need for a more robust field presence, including conducting inspections and compliance and enforcement activities. In response to the audit, additional staff were added to the program statewide, including 2 additional staff for Region 5. Also on staffing, the program recently was authorized an additional 3 full-time staff, 1 in each of our Region 5 offices, to work on water quality certifications related to vegetation management and wildfire prevention activities pursuant to Senate Bill 901. And I'll be mentioning SB 901 in just a bit. So once these new staff are hired, and it'll bring our staffing up to 12 PY and should help achieve our permitting and compliance and enforcement goals. During the Executive Officer's report at tomorrow's board meeting, Executive Officer Palupa will be presenting proposed fiscal year 2020-2021 program priorities for the region's programs. So this slide is just a preview of what you'll see tomorrow. The proposed priorities for the water quality certifications program include efforts to further improve timely issuance of water quality certifications and meet or exceed associated performance targets, to increase the numbers of inspections and compliance and enforcement activities, and to implement processes to improve issuance of certifications to Caltrans pursuant to Assembly Bill 1282, and I'll be mentioning AB 1282 in just a bit as well. In the previous slides, I've mentioned why timely issuance and inspections and compliance and enforcement improvements are needed and why we propose to prioritize them, and I'll mention Caltrans process improvements among several other program issues in the next few slides. Okay, in the next several slides, I'd like to provide updates on a few program activities and issues. First of all, online application. The State Water Board is working with the contractor to implement a new online application system to replace our current paper application process. The system is currently in beta testing, and a 2020 rollout is planned. This should make it easier for applicants to submit their applications and to track our review and issuance process. In August 2019, this board approved participation in the South Sacramento Habitat Conservation Plan, or HCP. This is a multi-agency regional permitting and planning approach to address issues related to 318,000 acres of planned development and conservation. Within the plan area, over 36,000 acres will become part of an interconnected preserve system, including approximately 1,000 acres of vernal pool habitat, 28 threatened or endangered plant and wildlife species, and their natural habitats will be conserved. In June 2019, this board approved a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to establish best practices and other processes for U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredging activities. And on a related note, we're currently working on a general order to cover maintenance dredging activities by other entities as well. And the MOU and the general order will help simplify and speed review and approval of maintenance dredging projects and help us free up time and resources for other program activities. Another general order is in development by the State Water Board for large habitat restoration projects. This is targeted for consideration of adoption by State Board in April of 2021. And this will be another helpful tool for us to create permitting efficiencies. All right, these next two slides.
Excuse me, on the Corps of Engineer MOU, does that cover all districts, or is that just San Francisco or Sacramento, or what?
Well, actually, do you have an answer for that?
Bailey, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought it was just for the deep water ship channels.
Yeah. Correct.
And that is out of which district?
So for that one, it's out of the San Francisco district.
Are we working on, do we need to work on something with Sacramento?
No, we do not. This operation is mainly just in the deep water ship channel. There doesn't need to be any, the dredging there is covered wholly by the San Francisco district.
I'd also say it doesn't really necessarily cover, or it doesn't cover anything in Region 2. It's just, as far as I'm aware, it's only
They
for...
handle that, because we took a trip, 2 years ago to San Francisco. And so this came out of that effort?
Yeah.
Good, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
They run that waterway, and most of the other waterways are managed by other irrigation districts or other entities. So there was that friction of regulating the feds is a little different than regulating somebody else. And so the MOU was our way of getting a regulatory measure in place for those activities.
No comment on your comment about the feds.
All right, these next two slides discuss issues that involve increased workload to the program, but also include the possibility of additional staffing to help cover the work. Senate Bill 1, the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, will invest $54 billion over 10 years to fix California's transportation system. Each year, $400 million will be used to maintain and repair California's bridges and culverts. This photo on the right is an example of a Caltrans culvert, and a culvert is simply a buried pipe that allows water to pass under a road. The photo on the left is a Caltrans bridge replacement project over Shasta Lake. Caltrans has committed to repair or replace 55,000 culverts and drains by 2027. And the significant and sustained surge of projects to be permitted by the Water Quality Certifications Program has begun and is putting a strain on our resources. Assembly Bill 1282 was passed to ensure that these Caltrans projects move quickly and to minimize unnecessary regulatory holdups. It directs development of a process for early engagement by multiple involved state agencies in the development of transportation projects, establishes deadlines for permit approvals, and provides for greater certainty of permit approval requirements. A multi-agency working group has been working to study the issue and is proposing solutions that recommend more pre-project consultation and other streamlining tools and training. A report to the legislature is due by the end of this year. The draft report recommends hiring one Caltrans liaison position at each regional water board to help prioritize and speed review and approval of Caltrans projects. If approved, we would receive one new staff position to help with this workload. Senate Bill 901 was signed into law in September of 2018. It was developed in response to the increasing frequency and intensity of California wildfires and the contributing threat caused by 43,000 miles of electrical utilities power lines. Electric utilities with service areas and lines within mapped elevated and extreme fire danger areas are now required to prepare and submit vegetation management plans and wildfire mitigation plans that describe the utilities' plans and activities to prevent, combat, and respond to wildfires affecting their service territories. A number of activities related to these efforts, such as vegetation management, power line hardening, and road improvements, will require issuance of water quality certifications. In order to speed our review and approval of these activities and not cause delays for this important work, additional staffing resources were approved for affected regional boards. As I mentioned earlier, for Region 5, 3 additional staff positions were approved for the Water Quality Certifications Program and are currently being filled. These additional positions will allow us to handle the increased numbers of applications, inspections, and compliance and enforcement activities. And now you'll hear about the State Water Board's new dredge and fill policy from Anna Marie Sains. Get her presentation up here.
Thank you. Thank you, Board Chair and fellow board members, and Brian Smith for inviting me to speak here today. My name is Anna Maria Sains, and I'm an environmental scientist at the State Water Board's Division of Water Quality in the Wetlands Permitting and Planning Unit. I'm honored to be here before you today to provide an update on the recently adopted state wetland definition and procedures for discharges dredge or fill material to waters of the state. In today's presentation, I'm going to give you some background and sort of explain to you how we got to where we're at today. I'm going to discuss some goals that the procedures are intended to meet and provide an overview of the procedures with an emphasis on the state wetland definition. Then I'll discuss the procedures' effect in existing regulation and next steps for implementation. And I'm also available to answer any questions you may have. There were a few specific actions that prompted the development of the procedures. The first being the 1993 California Wetlands Conservation Policy, commonly known as the No Net Loss Policy, which aims to ensure the overall no net loss and achieve long-term net gain in the quantity of quality in wetlands. There were also 2 Supreme Court decisions, one in 2001 and 2006, which limited the scope of the definition of a water of the U.S. and resulted in a reduction of federal authority to regulate isolated wetlands that were previously protected. In addition, the State Water Board issued a resolution in 2008, which directed State Water Board staff to complete 3 phases of work to protect wetlands in riparian areas. The procedures represent phase 1 in that resolution. Preliminary drafts of the procedures were released in 2016 and in 2017. The 2016 preliminary draft allowed for Water Board staff to apply discretion when setting requirements for applications. We received overwhelming public comments that requested that we limit case-by-case determinations and discretion for Water Board staff. These requests were made in order to provide more regulatory certainty for applicants, as well as increase environmental protection. In 2017, we released a draft that aimed to limit case-by-case determinations while still providing flexibility needed to effectively regulate individual projects. Revisions to the 2017 draft resulted in staff's proposal released in early 2019. This prompted an iterative stakeholder process. Essentially, we were tasked with parsing out language changes that stakeholders suggested that needed more clarification with specific policy issues for our board members to consider. We held multiple board meetings and staff workshops, as well as meetings with individual stakeholder groups. Ultimately, the procedures were unanimously adopted on April 2nd of 2019, with a condition that the procedures become effective 9 months after the approval by the Office of Administrative Law. We did receive that approval, and the procedures are set to become effective on May 28th of 2020. Delaying this effective date allows us staff at the State Water Board to provide training to Water Board staff as well as to the public, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Upon implementation of the procedures, we aim to address several specific goals. First, the procedures will clarify what is and what is not a wetland for the water boards, and increase protection of wetlands and other waters of the state. This will help ensure the no net loss and promote and increase the quality and quantity of California's remaining wetlands. This is done in the procedures through a number of ways, but a couple of mention are compensatory mitigation requirements. We set a minimum of 1-to-1 compensatory mitigation ratio and clarified compensatory mitigation plan requirements. We also implemented a watershed approach, which is an analytical process for evaluating environmental effects of proposed impacts to and compensatory mitigation for aquatic resources. The procedures also provide that that waters of the state outside of federal jurisdiction are consistently regulated. This includes waters that were left unprotected as a result of U.S. Supreme Court decisions, as well as potential future reduction in federal protection. In addition, the procedures will promote statewide consistency and by applying the same set of rules at all regional boards. Historically, there has been an inconsistent application of the program throughout the state, and implementation of these procedures will result in some regions doing more than they used to, while some regions will be restricted from mandating requirements that they had previously implemented. Finally, the procedures will encompass federal standards, which will help avoid duplicative work and streamline requirements so that both state and federal environmental concerns are addressed at once. However, as I've already mentioned, the procedures include requirements that are more restrictive than federal standards. The procedures consist of two distinct components. The first is the wetland definition, the delineation manuals, and the jurisdictional framework. The wetland delineation manuals are procedures that guide applicants and water board staff in determining whether or not a feature meets the wetland definition, and if so, the extent of that wetland. If the feature does meet the wetland definition, the jurisdictional framework will aid in determining if that wetland is also water of the state and therefore subject to regulation. The second component is the application submittal, review, and approval protocol that staff and applicants are required to follow, and these procedures apply to all waters of the state, not just wetlands. This component represents the steps that applicants and water board staff are required to follow by outlining what information should be submitted for a complete application and how water board staff will review those submittals. This does not represent a significant departure from how applications are currently processed, as the procedures include items that are typically needed to make determinations on projects and are already requested from applicants. If anything, the procedures outline the items needed to make determinations that applicants can reference prior to submitting applications, which will decrease the time to make application completeness determinations. It also includes a set of exclusions for areas and activities that are not subject to the procedures. These are typically referred to as procedural exclusions. And finally, Appendix A is the state supplemental dredger fill guidelines, which is a modified version of the federal guidelines that we included for consistency purposes. Next, I'm going to talk about the wetland definition. The definition requires that the feature has hydrology and anaerobic conditions in the soils, and if vegetation is present, that vegetation is dominated by hydrophytes. This means an area would meet the wetland definition even if vegetation is not present, as long as the other two indicators are there. This definition applies to all water board programs, but not to other agencies. This definition was developed by a technical advisory team which comprised of wetland scientists and managers in California, who found that this definition encompasses the diversity of ecosystems found in California when compared to the federal definition.
You just said, excuse me, you just said this applies to all water board programs, the definition, but not to other agencies? Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, that is correct. Other agencies have their own wetland definitions because the definitions are developed to meet different purposes.
Well, let's say we have an activity being carried out by Caltrans as an example that is causing a water quality issue. We would consider it a wetland, and Caltrans says they don't. How do we resolve that?
For the purposes of our permit, our rules apply.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction there. So other regulatory agencies that would be regulating wetlands, like the California Coastal Commission would have a one parameter definition, which would need to, the area would need to meet any one of those parameters.
Okay, thank you.
The procedures will be included in the forthcoming water quality control plan for inland surface waters, enclosed bays and estuaries in ocean waters of California. This means that the water quality control plan adopted will supersede water quality control basin plans adopted by the regional water boards, to the extent that any conflict exists for the same waters. The California Code of Regulations are still in effect. However, the procedures extend those regulations to waste discharge requirements to also regulate the discharge of dredge or fill material. Finally, I'm going to talk about next steps. Currently, we are in the process of developing implementation guidance for applicants. This is a public process, and we held a public stakeholder meeting on Monday to solicit input from them on specific questions they would like to have answered in implementation guidance. Draft guidance is planned for release in January or February of 2020 for an informal review by stakeholders. Then prior to the effective date, final guidance will be released and followed closely by several public workshops across the state to discuss the guidance and answer questions. Two of the workshops are planned to be held in Sacramento and one in Redding. In addition, we will be holding a 3-day training for water board staff in February and March, one in Northern California and one in Southern California. The training modules are being prepared by staff at the US EPA as well as the Army Corps of Engineers and staff at the regional and state water boards. And that concludes
I
my
have a
presentation.
question.
Sure.
Given the Fed's pushback on the auto emission standards and so on, has there been any pushback from EPA on California's efforts to regulate wetlands in this manner?
Funny you should mention that.
Yeah.
I think the interplay between the fairly dramatic retreat from US EPA in terms of where they consider federal wetlands, I think Bailey's going to start to cover it. But to be honest, and thank you, Ms. Sines, for the presentation here, this couldn't really have come at a more opportune time that the state would be exerting its regulatory authority right as the federal government was retracting from their obligations under the Clean Water Act. So it really fairly neatly fills the breach of what the federal government is proposing to do. Certainly their regulations will be challenged and have been challenged, but as the current administration, federal administration, pulls back, this really provides fairly comprehensive coverage, and they can't touch that. There's not a lot they can do to counteract our exertion of state law in this area.
Now, their pullback, has that been primarily through executive order, or?
I think Bailey's presentation will fill in some of those details.
You're really setting me up, Dr. Longley. All right. So good afternoon, Chair Longley and members of the board. My name is Bailey Toptipui, which looks like it disappeared from this slide. I'm with the State Water Board, Office of Chief Counsel, and I'm one of the 3 attorneys for the Central Valley Water Board. And today I will be providing an update on the federal regulatory updates affecting the Water Quality Certifications Program. Oh, yeah, this doesn't work. Yeah, I'm sorry about this presentation. It lost a couple of things. My presentation will touch on 3 recent federal regulatory actions. First, proposed revisions to the definition of waters of the United States. Second, new federal guidance on existing water quality certification regulations. And finally, proposed revisions to EPA's water quality certifications regulations. So the first regulatory action I'd like to update the board on is the changing definition of waters of the United States. The jurisdictional scope of the Clean Water Act is navigable waters, or as defined under the Act, waters of the United States, including territorial seas. Federal regulations and judicial case law have further defined the scope of the Clean Water Act, and you heard about a couple of the Supreme Court decisions that limited that definition earlier. So most recently, in 2015, the EPA and Army Corps finalized the Clean Water Rule, which was meant to clarify the scope of waters of the United States following those Supreme Court decisions. However, due to litigation, the 2015 Clean Water Rule is currently in effect in about half of the states, including California. In other states, where the 2015 Clean Water Rule was enjoined, the prior federal regulations that were promulgated in the 1980s are in effect. In February 2017, a presidential executive order directed the EPA and Army Corps to review the 2015 Clean Water Rule and rescind or revise as appropriate. In response, the agencies proposed a 2-step rulemaking process. Under Step 1, the agencies proposed to repeal the 2015 Clean Water Rule. And under Step 2, the agencies proposed to revise the definition of waters of the United States. The final Step 1 rule was issued in October 2019 and is set to go into effect in a few weeks. Once in effect, the scope of waters of the U.S. will return to the prior regulations that were promulgated in the 1980s. As explained in its final rulemaking, the agencies repealed the 2015 Clean Water Rule principally because of their concerns that the rule expanded the scope of federal regulation of waters beyond Congress's intent and intruded on states' rights. For Step 2, EPA and Army Corps issued a proposed rule redefining waters of the United States, and that was first issued in February 2019. That rule, as currently proposed, would limit the scope of waters protected under the Clean Water Act. 2 of the biggest proposed changes to the definition affect ephemeral streams and wetlands. The proposed definition would exclude ephemeral streams defined under the rule as surface waters flowing or pooling only in direct response to precipitation, such as rain or snowfall. The proposed definition would also exclude wetlands that do not have a continuous surface connection to other jurisdictional waters. This may include vernal pools, which are often connected to other waters via intermittent swales. As explained in the proposed rulemaking, the revised definition is meant to better reflect the text and structure of the Clean Water Act, as informed by its legislative history and Supreme Court precedent, and considering agency policy choices. The agencies further explain that the revised definition is meant to provide clarity and predictability for regulatory agencies and the regulated community, and strike a balance between Clean Water Act objectives and the sovereignty of states over their water resources. Step 2 is not yet final. The water boards commented on the proposed revision last spring, and among other things, recommended that the rulemaking follow a science-based rather than policy-based approach. And it's important to note that while the board has existing state law authority to protect a broader scope of waters than the Clean Water Act protects, a revised definition of waters of the United States would affect the Clean Water Act programs administered by the board, including the Water Quality Certifications Program. If the scope of waters of the U.S. is narrowed, it may lead to increased use of state resources and authorities to achieve the same level of protection of water resources as is currently afforded by the Clean Water Act. The next federal regulatory actions I'd like to update the board on specifically concern the board's Water Quality Certification Authority under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And I think a little brief recap of Section 401 will help provide some context for these proposed rules and guidance. Under Section 401, no federal permit can be issued for an activity that may result in a discharge to waters of the United States unless the state certifies that the activity will comply with applicable water quality requirements. For example, if a person needs a dredge or fill permit from the Army Corps, she needs to also obtain a water quality certification from the board. When the board receives a valid request for certification, it must act on the application within a reasonable period of time and either grant or deny the certification request. If the board denies the certification request, the federal permit may not issue. If the board grants the certification request, it may condition the certification based on Clean Water Act requirements and any other appropriate requirement of state law. If the board fails to timely act on the application, the certification requirements may be waived. And while certifications can be issued for other federal permits, such as FERC hydropower relicensing, my discussion will focus on certifications issued for Army Corps dredge or fill permits, as these are the vast majority of certifications issued by the Central Valley Water Board.
Before we move off that slide, this is the current that's proposed, is that correct?
This is Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, so this is in the statute.
Okay, provision, okay. So, but this would, under the new provision, they keep referring back to the Section 401. I mean, yeah, they keep referring back to Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. So the new policy that EPA is proposing would encompass this?
So this is the statute that Congress passed, Section 401.
Exactly, but this is being referred to in the new proposal, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And so the executive, the federal executive agency's authorities over its guidance interpreting its regulations and the statute and then its regulations. So and I'll get to those in the next slide, what they're proposing to revise in its regulations.
And so has there been any proposal? I'm presuming not, but has there been any proposal by the feds that they in any way would override state considerations? Because I know here in this bullet it says any other appropriate requirements of state law.
That would need to be a congressional action for them to do that, and Congress isn't doing that.
Congress is not doing that.
It is not doing that.
And I
no.
presume that was the case, but I just wanted.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, and so that's part of my purpose in putting, and again, this is, paraphrasing the language, but to put it before you, what the language that.
Excuse me, I've been up 12 hours now, so.
Yeah, no. Just to give context for what we're actually trying to interpret here, because that is the scope of the federal agency's power to just interpret that, not rewrite Congress's language. So in August of this year, Army Corps issued new regulatory guidance on its water quality certification regulations. And it's important to note that guidance, as opposed to rulemaking, cannot modify or otherwise supersede existing regulations. So there are several key aspects of the new guidance that I'd like to highlight. First, the guidance is intended to clarify the timeframes for the certifying agency to act on a certification request. Under existing core regulations, the board generally has 60 days to act on a certification request, unless the Corps determines a shorter or longer period is reasonable. The Corps' regulations state that the district engineer will verify that the certifying agency has received a valid request, and while neither the Clean Water Act nor Corps' regulations define request for certification, the Corps has traditionally interpreted a valid request as a complete application, which is consistent with California regulations.
So, shows that I need to know more about California regulations. A builder or a farmer or whomever covers over or destroys a vernal pool. Is that still an issue that we would regulate?
So if they fill the vernal pool without coming to the board first?
Yes.
Yeah, well, so that would be an unauthorized discharge. They didn't discharge with a permit. So that could be a cleanup and abatement order, other type of
But
enforcement
no, we
action.
still have responsibility, is that correct?
Yes.
Because that's not covered under the Clean Water Act.
Because of vernal pool, you mean as not being a water of the U.S.?
Yes.
They might be under
Yeah,
some.
it's the.
Well, if it's not connected to the water of the
Yeah,
U.S.
that's, and in my presentation, it's a little beyond the scope to actually walk through what is the current definition or proposed definition. But it's a little more complicated with that. But my point before was that in the proposed definition of water of the U.S., it could exclude some of the vernal pools that aren't, they don't have a significant nexus, or how the new rules would define it. If they're not, there's no continuous surface connection.
But we could still take
Yes.
enforcement action, you bet.
Because we would still consider it a water of the state.
And why I ask this, we've had these in front of us before.
Yeah. The complexity is that there's one set of statutes that would allow us to take action for the dredge and fill of water bodies that are subject to federal jurisdiction, and another set of statutes that we'd use when it's subject to state jurisdiction only. And so when the feds pull back their jurisdiction, we have to use different tools in the toolbox, but we absolutely still can take an enforcement action for the filling of a vernal pool. And we, in those cases, we do operate with Fish and Wildlife, which also has extensive tools to kind of take action against that.
And that also would apply to the wetlands that are not contiguous with the waters of the.
Exactly. So the wetlands that aren't contiguous, a lot of them would still be covered under the old federal rules, the rules that were proposed during the Obama administration. The new administration takes a very different view of that, but they still, both those activities still fall under the purview of the state laws.
And we have some of those down in Tulare County, not far from where you live.
Thank you, those are great questions. So the second key takeaway I'd like to point out from the new guidance is it identifies considerations for extending this tight certification timeline. And these include the type and complexity of the proposed activity, public hearing requirements, and the magnitude of impacts to aquatic resources. However, the Army Corps expressly notes that public notice requirements and workload or resources issues will not support extension requests. Finally, the guidance clarifies that it is the lead federal agency's responsibility to verify that a certification request has been received and to determine whether or not a waiver of certification requirements has occurred. Sorry again about the formatting issues. The EPA has also updated its guidance and regulations regarding water quality certifications. In April 2019, a presidential executive order directed EPA to review and revise its existing water quality certification guidance and regulations. In response, EPA issued new regulatory guidance in June of this year, and proposed regulations in August of this year. The guidance is meant to clarify existing regulations. Again, it cannot modify or supersede, otherwise override existing regs. The proposed regulations, on the other hand, would replace existing regulations. And as explained by EPA in the proposed rulemaking, the revised regulations are intended to update outdated regulations consistent with the Clean Water Act and case law, and in a way that increases predictability and timeliness. There are several key takeaways from both of these actions. First, both actions stress that the timeline for the certifying agency to act starts when the agency receives a certification request. This is a significant departure from prior guidance and practice and existing state regulations, which state that a certification request is not valid and the timeline to act does not start until the board receives a complete application. Again, those timelines are very tight, so that it's a very significant to staff to have to deal with that tighter timeline. Second, both actions strive to narrow the scope of information that must be submitted with a certification request. The proposed regulations go a step further than existing regulations or guidance and would create a new definition of certification request. Under the proposed definition, the applicant would need to provide only minimal information to request certification and start that time clock. By limiting the required application submittals, this proposed revision may result in the board having to issue more denials, as it may have insufficient information to ensure compliance with water quality requirements before the timeline to act expires. Third, the actions strive to limit the scope of requirements the state may consider when reviewing and conditioning the certification. While the Clean Water Act permits the state to impose any other requirement of state law, as we discussed earlier, the proposed regulations would limit certification conditions to Clean Water Act provisions and EPA-approved state or tribal Clean Water Act regulatory program provisions. This revision would exclude state law requirements that are not submitted to EPA for approval. Finally, the proposed actions signal a new practice of federal oversight over the state certification actions. The proposed regulations would allow the lead federal agency to review the validity of any certification denials or conditions set forth in the certification. For instance, the lead federal agency would be able to review the board's reason for denial to determine whether it is limited to ensuring compliance with the Clean Water Act and EPA-approved state requirements. If it determines it's outside the scope, the federal agency may construe the denial as a waiver and allow the project to go forward. The proposed revisions may also result in the federal agency rejecting certain requirements or conditions the board places in the certification if the federal agency determines the condition is outside the scope of appropriate water quality requirements. These proposed regulations have not been finalized, and the water boards provided a comment letter opposing the draft regulations in October of this year. So, in conclusion, there's been a lot of changes at the federal level that may affect the water quality certifications program. The most immediate impact will be for the board adapting to these tightening review timelines when considering applications for water quality certifications. Although, as Brian discussed earlier, program staff have already been diligently monitoring certification timelines, timely seeking extensions, granting certifications, or issuing denials as appropriate. Further, if some of the proposed changes take effect, the board may need to rely more heavily on its California authorities, such as issuing waste discharge requirements, to ensure continued protection of the region's water bodies. While these regulatory updates have not all been finalized and are subject to change over the coming months, the program will continue to track any developments, update the board as appropriate, and adapt as necessary. So I'll leave it back to Brian. Thank you.
All right, I'll just pull up summary here. Okay, so you've heard quite a bit about the Water Quality Certifications Program. I provided a background on the program and updates on a number of issues. Anna Maria presented on the State Water Board's new dredge and fill policy, and Bailey presented on several federal issues that may affect the program. Due to these issues, we project both an increase in the number of projects that come to us for certifications and an increase in the time it takes to issue certifications. And you've heard a bit about this already, but I just wanted to reiterate that, if, for example, depending on the outcome of the federal regulations changes, we may be required to bring water quality certifications like permits, so not water quality certs process, but regular board permits to board meetings for consideration of adoption, rather than being able to rely on the much quicker existing water quality certifications issuance process. So at the same time, we're targeting increased field activities and associated compliance and enforcement actions when appropriate. We have additional staff coming to the program that will help accomplish this work, but it's going to take a combination of dedicated staff, good management, and improved program tools to achieve these goals. And that's it. If you have any questions for any of us.
Questions?
Yeah, I guess I have a question, Bailey. When, at the end of your presentation, you said that if, because of these tightened timelines and a shorter period to review the applications, that the state may issue more denials for projects, but then the feds have the opportunity to waive the denial and allow a project to continue. Is that, did I get that straight?
So, I mean, it's complicated and the parts are moving. But I think from the board's perspective, if it doesn't have all the information it needs to ensure compliance with state law requirements, then we would issue more denials. But that is the risk if those proposed regulations do go through, that there is that oversight then of the validity of our denials or the conditions that we put in the certifications.
Well, then it's the burden is on the state to fully explain why they are denying. You talk about, if you just say insufficient information, that's not going to fly.
Yeah.
It's going to have to be detailed. And then it becomes a responsibility of the feds to review that, and if they review it rationally, hopefully they arrive at the same decision.
It's setting up a conflict.
Yeah.
It really is. At the end of the day, the statutory language in the Clean Water Act, and this was true when the Clean Water Act was adopted, and I used to work in this program quite a bit and worked on some litigation years past. The background of this provision is really that the federal government believes in states' rights here. Regardless of whether you want to take a light touch or a heavy touch, the water quality standards for the states are enforced by the states. So it's setting up a conflict, but at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, California will win if it sticks to we're protecting our beneficial uses, and we don't have what we need to protect beneficial uses in this document. Our authority will remain intact there.
And I assume these regulations won't be finalized for 6 months or so, or do you have a feeling for that?
I don't have a sense of the timeline, and there's always a risk too of litigation. So even if they would be finalized,
It'll be litigated. It'll be
It will
litigated.
be, yeah.
Thank
you.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead. I was going to ask the question of how you would address the issue of the quick turnaround that's come about with the changes in the federal regs. How is that going to impact what we do?
So I could probably take that. So right now, when we issue certifications, it's a pretty quick process. It goes through staff reviewing all the application materials and determining if the project can move forward. We can issue our certification with appropriate conditions. If we were required to use our Port Cologne state authority to issue permits rather than relying on the 44441 process, we would have to bring permits to this board at a board meeting like this for consideration, and that would be a huge impact on the timing as well as the the workload in the program. We are hoping that there's a better solution than that, but this is one of these issues that they're watching and we're going to have to adapt to.
Yeah, I mean, that was the reason I was asking the question, because I'm looking at not only the time, but the costs associated with something that was not there before.
No, absolutely. I mean, it happens a lot behind the scenes, but the water quality certification program, they really crank out the permits. None of those come to this board, but they process about 300 or more per year. And that's really extraordinary. And they do that under very, very tight time frames. I think the forest management unit is probably the only one that gives you the run for your money in terms of tighter timelines. They have slightly tighter timelines for some forest management reviews, but water quality certs go very, very quickly. The danger is if they don't fall under the federal program and they fall under the waste discharge requirements program, we have to bring them to the board, and that is a lot more process. That is a lot more time. That is potential delays for development projects. And one of the things that I find very daunting is if there are housing projects that get held up for that. That is really my biggest concern there.
Any further comments? Thank you very much. I have as agenda item number 8, Board Strategic Planning. And the executive officer is going to wax on eloquently about further changes and so forth. Is that something we could do tomorrow? Or?
It could be done tomorrow. I don't think that there would be a big concern. I do want to take a moment and introduce at least a couple members of the Strategic Planning Committee who are here in person. They work here in the Rancho Cordova office. I think I saw Chris Flower and Jonathan Muir over there. We, as part of the strategic planning effort, we set up a strategic planning committee, accepted a bunch of applications, sifted through, and made sure that we had folks represented from all 3 offices. Clint Snyder's also a member of that committee as part of the executive representation. But I wanted to make sure that Chris and Jonathan had an opportunity to introduce themselves here because they will be doing some of the outreach and drafting work that's involved with the strategic
Would you gentlemen please come up front here? Introduce yourselves to us. All you got to do is get on the website and you can read about us. You've been listening to us. Kind of embarrasses me. You want to sit down? You don't rather sit at the podium?
Yeah. This gets you off the hook for tomorrow.
So, you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you'd even want to hang out with us.
Well, I watch a lot of the videos, so it seems like a great group to hang out with. So I'm Chris Flower. I'm a senior engineering geologist here. I primarily work in underground storage tanks. I've been at the water boards now for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was in consulting for about 10 years. So prior to underground storage tanks and consulting, I did a lot of petroleum hydrocarbon cleanup as well. In terms of the strategic group, it just seemed like a good opportunity to provide some insight into how the office grew and how the culture is kind of changed over time.
Great, because what you say is very true. It'd be nice to get some input on that, because certainly that should influence what we come up with. Yes?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Muir. I'm presently in the Forest Activities Program here. In this office, I've been here for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was in a similar position at Region 1 in Santa Rosa. And before that, it was the Department of Water Resources, and before that, it was the Bureau of Reclamation, and before that, I was a meteorologist. And so I've always been drawn, I suppose you could say, to the water-related fields. And so this seemed like an opportunity to maybe give my input and insight a little bit into
You're an environmental scientist?
Engineering geologist.
Engineering
Yeah,
geologist.
I'm an aquatic geologist.
Oh, good.
Clint's on the committee too.
You're not like him, I hope.
And I'll mention, you know, kind of my personal observations. Chris has done an incredible job, as you know. Brian Newman, who's a program manager for our UST unit, has had some tough health issues over the past year and a half. Chris, along with Joe Mello, stepped up and filled the breach, and that unit kept functioning without missing a beat, which is truly extraordinary. Jonathan, I'll also add, really helped enliven the Rancho Cordova Employee Association, which, you know, I think his leadership there makes the office a little nicer place to come into work. So I look forward to their contributions. We've got a number of other staff who thanks for taking the hot seat here, impromptu. Number of other staff on the strategic planning committee who we'll get to meet in the months ahead.
Do we get a roster of who's on the committee?
Yeah,
And just a quick scurb, one sentence.
I'll send out the roster again. I did
Great.
send it out just a short time ago, but I'll make sure that the board members
I
have
must
it.
have missed that.
There's a flood of emails and
Yeah, okay.
amidst the comments on grasslands and et cetera.
Very good.
Patrick, I'm curious, how many applications did you get for this committee?
We got a few. We had to recruit in a couple of the offices, and but we had to be selective.
It attracted the geologists who were just
You
can't
know,
resist.
It's something
strategic
about
planning.
it.
Carl's favorite subject.
They like rock hard issues.
I tell you, and we did, you know.
I'm sorry. I've hung around with Clay too much.
Yeah. We you know, we did need to recruit somebody from Reading and somebody from admin unit to round out the portfolio, because we had a slot reserved for both of them, but the others were selective. So
I know why you don't have engineers. It's too hard to pry them away from their
we've got
computers.
some. We've got some.
Oh, you
don't
got
worry
some
about that.
engineers. Good. You actually got them away from their computers. Worst of all is modelers. My God.
No lawyers allowed, though. That's for sure.
The interesting thing about lawyers, you don't even have to invite them. They just show up.
My goodness, it's getting late in the day, isn't it?
We're like annoying relatives.
Okay, very good. If we could have a little discussion tomorrow, and that's a personal request on my part, because I've been up way too long.
Yeah, no.
And I'm supposed to go to a party, and I have to make a phone call, work related.
No, certainly. Well, we can. I mean, if it's the pleasure of the board to continue it to tomorrow, we can certainly have that discussion tomorrow.
Okay, we'll continue this till tomorrow then.
They may not be here tomorrow, but we'll have that discussion. We'll figure out where it fits into the agenda. The way this is planned is we have the first meeting of the Strategic Planning Committee will be shortly after the new year. That's when all the folks who are on the committee, the 7-member committee, will be meeting, including the folks from Reading and the folks from Fresno on a video phone, basically with the members of the work group, who are Carl and Mark, and to talk about strategic planning and to basically digest what this board has decided thus far, and to start help crafting the strategy for writing the thing and for conducting the outreach that's going to be a component of it, that's going to start in the spring.
Sounds good. So, once again, thanks for agreeing to come work with us, and we will continue this discussion tomorrow. We are recessed until then.
Absolutely.
8:30 tomorrow morning, folks.